This morning is quite a treat. We started a series last weekend, and we're actually going to pause from that this morning. A couple years ago, it was almost a couple years ago now, I think, I got an email from a guy named Jack Oberweiser from Carroll College, who I later learned is like the preferred professor over at Carroll, and he was offering to take me out to lunch. Now, what I didn't know was the backstory was that a former student of his, who's been involved with church his entire life, his father-in-law was coming to Narrate, and his father-in-law had never been involved with church before. And so his son-in-law, are you following me? Son-in-law who lives in Utah, emailed Jack Oberweiser, who was involved in some mission stuff to Haiti, and said, I'll give you some money to Haiti, and I'll give you money to take Adam to lunch to figure out what the heck is going on with my father-in-law. Like, he's attending this church, and I don't quite understand it, so will you go get the pulse of that place and figure out if it's wacky or good or what's the deal? And so Jack and I had lunch, and it was over that lunch that a friendship began that led to our sending the soccer balls with Carroll students to South America a couple different times. And Jack has become this friend who challenges me because he's the type of person who you don't sit across the table from him and talk theology. You sit across the table from him and hear him share these rich stories of this incredibly courageous life lived with Jesus, and I'll just let him take it from there. I'm going to pray for him, and then he's going to come up here, and he's actually going to crack open the word, so to speak, this morning. God, thanks for Jack. Thanks for what you've done in his life. Thanks for the unique way, God, that you've invited us to be a kind of collaborative networking church. So exciting to have him here and influence us and share his stories, and even looking ahead, God, as we imagine some of the different ways that you're leading us to follow him. We love you. Amen. Come on up here, Jack. Would you give Jack a Narrate welcome?
Good morning. And thanks very much for allowing me to speak. I have to start with a disclaimer, which is that I have no authority whatsoever to be speaking in a church. It makes me very nervous. Adam asked me several months ago if I would be comfortable talking to this group, and I said no. I wanted to, and I feel very blessed to have this opportunity, but comfortable was not the word that I would have used. It is amazing, it's an amazing story, I think, how Adam and I did get together, because as he said, you guys are doing something really wonderful, and there's a lot of people out there trying to figure out what exactly it is. And one of my students, who is a staunch supporter of the Catholic Church in Utah and does wonderful things and is involved, really has a lot of faith in action programs going on his own, still said, check out this Narrate church. And I did, and we found that Adam and I really do we're sort of on the same page in a lot of ways. So I guess what I wanted to share with you a little bit is my faith journey, and as I get older, that story gets longer, so I have to condense it now. But maybe just give you some idea of why Adam and I are friends, and how I think that maybe some of what I've been involved in hopefully will speak to you, and maybe we can develop some other type of partnerships. I like Adam's phrase of Christ follower, because I guess I would consider myself a Christ follower. And the only thing I know about Christ is what I read, and I realize it's been translated in different languages, and much of it was written long after Jesus was dead. But if you kind of get past that, I know theologians study these things and analyze them and write books, and I love reading their books. But I also just like reading the red letter print in the New Testament, and I find that it really speaks to me in a lot of ways. So I want to start by just telling you a little bit about my growing up in Anaconda, Montana, 80 miles away. I always say I'm the oldest of 9 children. Actually, I'm the oldest of 7 biological children, but I'll explain where the 9 comes from real quickly. But my dad was a teacher, my mom was a nurse. We didn't have a lot. We grew up at a housing project, not a lot of money, but we had such a good, enjoyable, carefree lifestyle. I didn't have problems growing up, and my family didn't have problems. And I was spoiled. I was spoiled rotten because of the love that I had from my parents. And they were staunch Catholics, and we went to Mass every Sunday. One Sunday, we're at Mass, and this is the mid-'60s, and the priest from the pulpit says that there's this crisis in America because Fidel Castro, who was the new dictator of Cuba, had sort of decided to let people leave Cuba if they didn't want to have anything to do with it anymore. If they didn't like his regime, then fine, get out. And a lot of people were taking him up on it. And so there were a lot of planes flying from Havana to Miami. And at that time, a lot of parents were putting their kids on the plane first, and then they would follow on the next plane. Well, Castro, as Castro would be, changed his mind one day in the middle of the day, literally, and said, all right, that's it, nobody else is leaving. Well, there were hundreds of kids that were in the Miami airport waiting for their parents, and no parents. And nobody knew what to do with these kids. Catholic Charities got involved, and a lot of these kids ended up going across the country to different group homes and foster homes and basic institutions, orphanages and things. So this priest in Anaconda, Montana is telling his parishioners, we need to step up, Some of you need to help out and take a couple of these kids in. Well, we pile in the station wagon after Mass, and I can still remember our old station wagon, no seat belts, there's 7 kids all over the place. And my mother turns to my father and says, we're making that call when we get home. We're calling to take a couple of kids. And my dad just went, yes, dear. Sure enough, within a week, we had 2 Cuban refugees, ages 10 and 12, move into our family. What was interesting, though, was that our Cubans were Chinese. These were 2, their family had immigrated from Macau, which is just off the mainland of China, to Cuba a year earlier. And so their parents thought they'd have a better life for their kids, and then, Castro comes along. So these little guys were just barely speaking Spanish. They spoke Chinese fluently. And some other families had taken Cubans that were actually Cubans, and so there was a lot of Spanish going on. But these kids lived with us for about 2 years. And so in my thinking, I'm the oldest of 9 because they just became part of our family. And my mother was heartbroken when their parents finally got over from Cuba and were able to take them. They all moved to Los Angeles, but those kids never forgot my parents. They have, to this day, never missed a birthday, never missed Christmas. They're both doctors, these 2 young Cuban kids. None of my birth siblings made it to be doctors. But these kids flew my mom and dad down for their weddings. They flew them down for children's births. My parents have several grandkids from those kids right now. And it was such a wonderful experience for my family because we had been sort of insulated, even though we were a big family, and families were big back in those days, to suddenly have this extra component that has never really left our family. I think it was wonderful for my parents. It was truly wonderful for my siblings. It was wonderful for our community in Anaconda. I went on, finished high school, and I started going to school here at Carroll in the early 60s. And we were living, a bunch of us were living off campus, and we were pretty good people. We partied a little bit, but we were good students, and, I think we were decent human beings. We lived next door to a family that by a lot of standards you'd say was dysfunctional. There was a lot of alcohol abuse, a lot of fighting and screaming, and they had a young son, this family next door to me and my roommates, who was about 17. And he was just flirting with getting in trouble with the law. But he used to hang out at our house all the time. And he'd just come over and he wanted to talk about college. And he saw that as really out there because he wasn't sure he was finishing high school. But we'd have lunch with him and we'd take him in. And some nights if he did have homework, we'd help him with his homework. One day he decides to steal a car. So he takes off and he's in big trouble. And his social worker happened to stop by our house and said, do you guys know this kid very well? Do you like him? And we said, oh, geez, we love him. He's a good kid. Too bad about stealing that car, darn. Well, they were getting ready to send him to Pine Hills, the state reform school in Miles City. And his social worker said, would one of you, and he looked at me, would come to court and just sort of be a character witness for this guy? Just tell him that he's not such a bad guy. Maybe we can keep him in the community. I said, no problem. So we go in, and there's a prosecutor, and there's a defense lawyer, and so the defense lawyer is kind of priming me with questions. Do you trust this kid? How well do you know him and stuff? And I'm really trying to make this guy sound good. Well, the judge sort of interrupts. He says, okay, let me ask you this. He said, you'd trust this kid in your home? I said, yeah. He says, would you trust him in your home if you weren't there? I said, oh, of course. He was in our house a lot of times watching TV when we'd come back from school. Well, would you trust him with your car? Of course I trust him. I'm trying to make the kid look good. So all of a sudden the judge says, well, what would you think if he was living with you, if he actually moved in with you? Now I'm thinking, oops, I didn't mean to go quite that far. And And so the social worker stands up. He says, look, Your Honor, he said, you couldn't put this kid with, a teenager with another teenager. I think I was actually 20, though, at the time. But he was 17. And the judge says, well, why can't you place him in? He said, because you have to be a licensed foster parent in order to take in a kid. And the judge said, so what, is there an age limit on foster parents? Well, you have to be an adult. Well, 18 was the legal age then, so I was an adult. He said, but Your Honor, he's single. He's not even married. And the judge said, so the law says you have to be married to be a foster parent? And it turns out I was one of the first single foster parents licensed in the state of Montana. And the kid moved in, and my roommates would tease me, and his friends would, go ask your daddy if you can go out. And, okay, son, but it was a great relationship, and nothing really changed except he officially lived with us, and I had to be the guy that if he missed school, they'd call. And the kid graduated. He actually finished high school, and he's one of the good stories. He ended up a little difficulty in the Marines, but after the Marines, he ended up becoming a spiritual leader for the Turtle Mountain Chippewa, and he lives on the reservation out there, and he's a very religious young man and just does a wonderful job and has a whole slew of kids of his own. But that was how I first sort of got involved with the foster care system. And I went on and I finished at Carroll, and I got a teaching job down in Twin Bridges, Montana. Twin Bridges it was where the Montana Children's Center was. And a lot of the kids there were darn good kids, but they just had lousy homes. Things weren't really working for them. And so the judge had kind of placed them down there, and I was their teacher, and I got to know them real well. And just really would haul a lot of these kids up to Carroll football games, and I'd take them to my parents' house over Christmas. My parents by then were used to having everybody's other's kids living there too, so it worked out great. After 2 years in Twin, though, I had always wanted to join the Peace Corps, and I thought, I need to go see the world. So I went to Africa and was sort of a failure in the Peace Corps. I came home early, and I think part of it, that's a whole other story, but part of it was I had this sort of guilt going on that I had all these kids that trusted me and liked me, and we were kind of making some progress with back in Montana, and I had to go to the Congo and leave them, and I'd get letters from them too sometimes. So anyway, when I came back from the Congo, I still had that foster parent license, and I wanted to know where all these kids were that I had taught, because they had closed the Montana Children's Center. It was shut down. Well, I found out that an awful lot of those kids had become homeless. They were just street kids, and they were living on the south side of Billings. They were living up on Hill 57 in Great Falls, if any of you are familiar with some of the poorer areas of our larger cities. And I had a bright yellow Volkswagen van, and I could drive into any of these neighborhoods and just park my van, and somebody'd be walking on the street, and I'd say, hey, go find Federico Lucero. Tell him Jack's looking for him. We don't know no Federico Lucero. I'd say, well, just go find Freddie. Tell him Jack's, and Freddie'd show up 5 minutes later. And then we'd load up the van, and we'd drive around, we'd get ice cream, and we'd drop kids off afterwards, but invariably the last 2 or 3 were kids that didn't have a place to get dropped off. And so I sort of went out on a limb the first couple of times I did this, but I just took them home with me. I drove back to Helena, and I moved them in. I got them enrolled in school. I had to tell a few stories about who I was and who they were. But then I'd get a hold of their PO or their social worker and just say, I've got Ricky Valdez living with me, and, well, he's AWOL from this group home, and he's wanted for this. And I'd say, yeah, but he's in school, and he's living with me, and he's doing good. Well, they couldn't wait to make that official, because that was just one less kid on these insurmountable caseloads that workers have. So probably for the next about 10 years, I just started taking more and more kids in. The most I ever had at one time was 4, and there was 3 little kids from Billings. They were all Hispanic kids and a little guy from Anaconda. And the neighbor lady in our neighborhood called me over once and told me that this was really a nice neighborhood. She said, but you will notice that there are quite a few minorities. And I said, they're all living with me, I think, at this point. But, we got along good with the neighborhood. I found that a lot of these kids that had been in trouble, and there was no question that they'd been in trouble. But my rules were you either work or you go to school, and I won't let you have drugs in the house. And it wasn't like, as far as I know, maybe they did, but certainly nothing that ever caused any problems. They didn't call me dad. They didn't look at me, I don't think, as a father figure. But I was the guy they lived with, and they had a home. They had a place to come home. They could have their friends over. They'd introduce me as Jack. The birth parents of a lot of these kids were great folks. They just couldn't handle being parents, which is unfortunate. So it doesn't take much to make a baby, but raising babies is a lot harder. And so it wasn't like some other family was taking their kids away from them because it was just Jack. Well, they're just living with Jack. And that's kind of the way I saw it, too. It was fun. It was, what's all this have to do with, well, I got to finish the first part of this, though. I ended up adopting one of my foster kids. He was 16, but he wanted to be adopted. He wanted his name he just wanted to be part of a real family. He wanted it legal, so I adopted him. And it was about a month later that he informed me his girlfriend was pregnant. And so now I'm the father and about to be the grandfather. And I'm thinking, I got to go meet this young girl's family, and she was really young. And found out that her mom was a single mom with 4 kids. So I go and I meet this woman, and she's wonderful. She said, things happen, but you and I got to work together to keep our kids in school, and we also got to help raise this baby. I said, you got it. So I was working at a group home at the time, and I had afternoon shifts, so I drive over and I pick up the baby in the morning. She'd take him in the afternoon. We ended up doing that for a second baby that came along the next year. So we were sort of co-grandparenting, and we thought, geez, why not get married? So we got married. We've been married 26 years this fall. And in the meantime, my wife went back to college, and she got a degree in social work. So she was working for Child Protective Services, and her solution to the problem of child abuse was to bring every kid home that she took out of. So we had a lot of foster kids. And then one night, the night before she graduated, actually, we got a call in the middle of the night from one of my former co-workers at a group home who was now a social worker. It was a nasty abuse case. I won't even, sometimes I tell that story, but you don't even want to hear it. It was just, trust me, that little kids should not go through what they go through. 9 months old, they bring him to me. We get him at midnight. Patsy's graduating the next morning. Social worker says, no problem, I'll be by to pick him up in the morning before graduation. Well, he didn't show up. So we take this little baby that we've known for 6 hours to my wife's graduation. And the Carroll people were just wonderful. I mean, they had heard sort of some of the stories we'd been involved with kids before. And when I told them what was going on, the academic dean's wife said, here, I don't need to march in the procession. You go be with your wife for graduation, I'll watch this baby. So my wife's graduation movies are all of her walking down to get her diploma, and then up in the stands, and there's the baby getting bottle fed, and then back down. And nobody ever did come get that little guy. He's 22 now, and we adopted him, and we adopted his little sister that came in the next year. Okay, so this is a church. Why am I just telling all these stories? Part of my faith journey has to do with being raised Catholic, but always looking and being a little nervous about all the don'ts. It seemed like there were so many rules you couldn't break and commandments, which were important, but that I was looking more for the to-do list. And in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, there's just this great story. And I remember the first time I ever hearing it, but it sort of stuck with me forever. And that's where somebody asks him what the end of the world's going to be like. What's Judgment Day going to be like? Are we going to line up and God's going to go through all of our sins and check off? And if we pass the test, we get in. If we don't, we don't. But when they asked Jesus, he said, well, at the end of the world, we're going to have these 2 big groups of people. And this first group, I'm going to look at them and I'm going to say, you're coming with me. Welcome to the kingdom that my fathers had forever. Because I was hungry and you fed me. And I was thirsty and you gave me a drink and I didn't have any clothes. You put some clothes on me. And I was sick and you cared about it. And I got locked up and you actually came to visit me in prison. And these people are going to be amazed and they're going to say, but Jesus, when were you hungry and I fed you? When were you thirsty and I gave you something to drink? When were you in jail and I came? And Jesus says, the kicker line, of course, whatever you do for the least of my brothers, you're doing to me. And then he looks at the other group and he says, you're out of here because I was hungry and you didn't want to feed me and I didn't have a place to live and you didn't care and I was locked up and you said, hey, probably deserves it. And of course, those people are shocked too. When did we ever see you, Lord, and not do that? And he said, if you didn't do it to the least of my brothers, you didn't do it to me. I don't know who the least of my brothers are. There's all sorts of official versions that he was talking just about Christians, and some people say that it was, to try to get the Romans to quit persecuting Christians, and I don't know. But it just spoke to me for how many people I'd met. I'd had this perfect life. My family was, loved me to death. My parents are still alive. I mean, God love them. They're in their 80s. But there were these other folks that hadn't had it so good, and I had some opportunities to maybe help them out. And it was funny how that chain would work. One of the second or third foster kids, I can't remember where in the line. There's been a lot. But this young guy finished high school, and he liked me. He was one of those ones that gave me some credit. And all I did was give him a place to live. But he'd say, if you take any more foster kids, you bring them to my house, and I'll tell them how important it is to listen to you. Well, for years, this kid got married real early, and he was up in Kalispell. And I would take whichever foster kids I had at the time and go to Kalispell. We'd go skiing. And he'd treat us so good, we'd all sleep on his floor in sleeping bags. But sometime, during that time, he would pull these kids aside, and he'd say, hey, pay attention now. You probably don't think he's right all the time, and he comes off real dumb sometimes. But hang in there. I'd say, thanks, Bobby. But, to watch him paying it back, that paying forward thing. Like, he'd been one of my kids. He ended up being a foster parent. Another one of my former foster kids lives 3 houses down from me, right here in town now. He's in his mid-40s. He has taken in every family member of his that needed a place. He's got kids. He's adopted his grandkids. It's so cool to see that expansion. And I was supposed to mention at the beginning of this, and I didn't, but I guess I wanted to talk to you all about was hospitality, inclusion. How do you include people in your circle? How do you sort of reach out a little bit more and make a little bit more room for people that really are just dying to be included in something? It seems to me this church does a tremendous amount of that already, and hopefully we're going to be able to talk maybe about doing that even more as we go down the line. I don't know who Jesus is other than what I read and what he said and what other people said he said, but I know he took care of sick people. Good Lord, he healed blind people and deaf people and people that couldn't walk. And I believe mentally ill people. In the Bible, it talks about demon-possessed folks, but the way they describe them, I'm convinced that that there's a whole piece of mental illness in there. And one of my adopted daughters that we started with in foster care, she suffers from a mental illness, and to see what that does to people and how it really excludes them in so many ways. My Carroll College students, so many of them have been the best facilitators for my kids and my foster kids over the last 20 years. I can't thank them enough. They've been friends, they've been mentors, they've been babysitters, and they've really helped me kind of do what my wife and I try to do with all of our kids. If you're a Christ follower, I think you can do some of those things. Christ didn't exclude too many people. He got in trouble for breaking some of the rules that just didn't make sense in a communal aspect. He hung out with tax collectors, not the most popular people in that time. He helped a woman caught in adultery. He even cured a Roman soldier's son, and I don't think the Jews were really getting along well with the Romans back then. But he just didn't seem to narrow it down to, there's one little part in the Bible, I finally found it, I was going to give Adam the verse, but there's this one little section of the Bible where his friends come to Jesus and say, your mother and your brothers and your sisters are outside, they're waiting to talk to you. And he said, who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters? He said, you are my mother and my brother and my sisters. You people, if you're following me. And that always bothered me before. I always kind of thought, well, that was rude. That's, his mother and brothers come to see him and he doesn't. But the more I thought about it, and just in terms of my own life, he's inclusive. He's not saying you can't just have one mother or just one brother or one sister. I've gone to Mexico 3 times in the last couple of years with an Engineers Without Borders group at Carroll. And we work with these little Mexican kids. And God, I just love them. But every single one of them will ask me if I have kids, and they want to know my kids. And my Spanish isn't that good, so trying to explain my family situation is kind of crazy. The mailman one time told me that we got mail for 13 last names at our address. So, but when I would tell these little kids that, yes, I am a grandpa, they said, well, would you be my grandpa? And I've got all these little Mexican kids that call me grandpa whenever I go down. I'm Grandpa Jack. I thought, no, that is just so cool. There's nothing noble about that. That is just cool, having Mexican grandkids, having Ecuadorian grandkids. I mean, I love it. And a few more years, I already have some great grandkids, but they still think I'm too old, but not really. That idea of inclusion, how do you open up and make space for just a few more? And it's a commitment. I mean, I wouldn't try to say, hey, everybody line up, be a foster parent tomorrow. There's some downsides. There's some sad sides. I've had kids go to prison. I've lost kids to suicide. I've had kids that just disappeared. I mean, we lived together for a while and they're gone. But it's an incredibly rewarding thing. It's fun. I mean, Adam said it was courageous. I don't see that at all. But you want to go into it for the right reasons. But you don't have to jump right into being a foster parent. There are a lot of things, and Adam and I have talked a little bit about your church maybe helping sponsor some foster families. Honor them with a turkey at Thanksgiving, even if they can afford it. Just say, yeah, I know, but we're going to do this because we respect what you're doing. Providing respite care. Respite care is huge for foster families because sometimes foster kids can be tough. One of your parishioners was telling me earlier today that she knows of a 14-year-old that's been in 31 foster homes. Now, you can say, well, this guy must be a hellion, and he probably is. But what is that doing to that kid? 31 placements. So whoever's going to try to take that young man on could probably use a little bit of respite care, a little bit of assistance. My wife and I took a boy in right at Christmas time once because the foster family that he was living with had already made plans to go to Disneyland over Christmas. And they really just didn't want to include him in that trip. They were meeting family, and they didn't know how it was going to go. And so they went back to the state and said, could you find someplace else for this boy for Christmas? Because we're going to go to Disneyland. Well, you can imagine what a happy camper this guy was when he showed up at our house. I mean, he was angry. And my kids and my grandkids that were at home, I mean, we were all going, can we handle this guy? But boy, when you started thinking about what he'd been through and what had just happened to him right at Christmas, not a good deal. We heard of another little kid that was placed right before Christmas, and he showed up at the foster family's house with nothing. I mean, they had to move him quick, so he didn't have clothes, he didn't have shoes, nothing. So I put the word out at Carroll College, and this was Christmas of 2002, because that was the first year Carroll won the national championship. And the night before the football team flew off to Georgia, about 10 of them showed up outside my house with bags of toys and clothes and everything for this little kid that I had just, mentioned in a few of my classes needed some help. And I went into my office, and I was just so touched. I wanted to go in and send an email out to everybody. And I opened my office door, and there was probably about $50 in change that people had just slid under the door. You're included there in what happened for that little kid. Even if you didn't take him on as a foster child yourself, you helped out with that kind of thing. So one of the things that I brought a bunch of brochures. My daughter is actually a child protective service worker right now. And we just talked about some things that they could use some help with. And it's always monetary things, of course. But, maybe finding a place where people can visit their children that have been removed for various reasons. Sometimes babies are taken away from birth parents because they're being neglected. They're just not being fed right. They're not being seen medically. And it's just kind of out of ignorance. Folks didn't really learn that from their parents. And so social workers have to try to teach them some of these new skills. But it's tough to do that in an office building, in a state office building. So one of the things we were thinking of is, trying to find maybe some local churches that would let them use their kitchen or sort of a reception area where some of these visits could take place. And I was thinking, you guys meet here, so this probably wouldn't be a great place. And yet, but I mentioned this before. I think Sarah said, well, yeah, but we can partner with some other churches. We'll get the ball rolling. And that's what's so cool about you people. I mean, that you are, your faith in action. I mean, your faith in practice. It's not just what you're doing and how you're doing it. I guess the last thing I'd share with you, just in terms of my story, and a lot of times, I mean, over the years, people have patted us on the back and, oh, wow, this is really something that you do all this stuff for foster care. And I always think the people that should be getting the pats on the back are the people that are raising their kids, the people that are doing the right job with their kids. They're going through life with their children. And nobody's having a National Parents Day at the end of every week. But I think parents should be on a pedestal. I mean, if you're raising your kids and you're able to pull that off, those are the champions. Those are the people that should be just applauded, every time they turn around. There would be no need for foster parents if parents were doing a job. So, I mean, I've had a kick of a life, and I'm not over yet, I hope. But the idea that foster parenting is any more special than real, honest-to-God parenting, that's where I would. So, anyway, thanks again for letting me visit with you. We brought some brochures, but a lot of them disappeared after the 9 o'clock hour. But I'm going to bring some more, and maybe Adam and Sarah will just sort of hand them out next time. And Adam's going to say a prayer now. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. If you were with us during the Back to Your Future series, you remember we talked about the who? That it's not about what, it's about who. And that's the way I felt about Jack recently, is like, here's another who. Here's another guy who's leading and influencing, and so we're just going to jump on your shirt tails and steal your ideas and serve right alongside you. So we join me in just closing this up in prayer. God, thanks. It's quite the challenge on hospitality from a very unique angle, and it's so refreshing to not hear principles and not hear academic ideas, but to hear real life story and to see it. And so, God, the way you work and the way your Spirit moves is you can use that type of inspiration and challenge and conviction in myriad ways. And yet, we just pray that we would have the courage to obey you, even when obeying you is not the easy thing. Thanks for Jack and his wife and his heart and his relationship with you, Jesus. We're grateful. Amen. Thanks again, Jack. So in many ways, what we're doing this morning is kind of taking the lid off a little bit of some things that are coming in the next couple months, and particularly as we look towards Vision Weekend. If you're familiar with Narrate, you know that we set aside that first Sunday after Labor Day to kind of go like, here's where we think God is taking us next. And one of the things that we've been working on pretty sincerely over the last year has been, okay, Lord, but who are the poor people directly that you're calling us to serve? As we've been praying about that and thinking about that, it just feels to us like all things foster care, and especially because we have a who in terms of Jack is the way God's leading us. And so we'll talk more about that in the weeks that come. My challenge to you would be to pray and to consider, maybe God's calling you to do some foster stuff. Maybe you're a business owner. There's some stories coming from some business owners of guys going like, hey, we love what you guys do with people. We have some of our resources. How could we serve together? So all that's coming. I guess I'm just inviting you to pray and dream, and if you want to have conversations, let us know. There's a class, I think was one of the things that we forgot to mention was so becoming a licensed foster parent, obviously part of that involves some training, and the next class is scheduled for September. And one of the neat things there is Tom and Sarah Bremer, who many of you know, she's on staff here, and they're both pretty integral people to this place. They've been in the foster care stream for a while. They've been pursuing being foster parents long before this conversation between Jack and I kicked into gear, and so they'll be taking the class in September. So, there's a chance if you want to pursue that or even consider that and want to do that with some people they're already in that stream, so you can talk to Tom and Sarah as well. They're just a few steps ahead of you. Sure love you guys. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.